Alrighty, y'all. So here is the much anticipated, I know, Unit 6 review for your Unit 6 test. What I've done is I've gone through and I've kind of found some slides that I think will work. I'm going to kind of shorten it down. It's not going to be as long as usual because you've got a lot to cover and not much time to do it. So without much ado, just a reminder here, it's going to be dull, but at least I hope useful. So let's go to the first slide here. The first thing we're going to talk about is what leads to people moving out west, because one of the first topics that you guys are supposed to know about is Western migration. You know, the Old West. They used to make a lot of movies about that. This land had already been settled, remember, by Native Americans living in what today, where we go then called the Great Plains, stretching from Canada all the way down to the great state of Texas. And of course the Great Basin. If you guys remember earlier in the year, we talked about the Great Basin out there in Utah and Nevada and Colorado and Wyoming, and I hope I've got those states. No, that's Idaho. Well, you know what I mean. So anyway, one of the most famous tribes you need to know is, of course, the Sioux Indians. That's this word right here, S-I-O-U-X. Don't pronounce it Seahawks or anything like that. It's Sioux. Like, you know, you get sued by somebody, which in this case would mean getting attacked. But anyway, these Native Americans were forced to move westward to survive. And of course, what this means is they then collide with other tribes, and this is going to lead to a lot of conflicts between them. Now, it's not true that they didn't fight each other before. They did a lot. But of course, being pushed westward to land that was settled by other Indians is going to lead to more fighting. I have the word indigenous here in red face. Please make sure that you know that, or in red bold here. Wasn't trying to make any evil joke, I promise. Indigenous, meaning people who were already there. Make sure you know that name. And you guys remember, of course, we talked about last semester about Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act that relocated 6 tribes into what is today Ocklagetdownhoma, and of course up here in Kansas, as you can see here in the 1830s. So there were people living there, and then of course as the settlers are going to come, there's going to be conflict with them over that land. It's as old as history. You know, people come in, there are people there, they fight, and there's usually bloodshed, right? Now, and of course, we've already talked about Manifest Destiny, so Mr. D doesn't need to get a whole lot more into that. You guys know that really well, or you better have. Now, this is one of the few slides that actually has a different color background. I removed all the color, or so I thought. One thing that's going to lead to a lot of this migration, you absolutely positively have to know, was an act passed in 1862 by during the Civil War by the Republicans. The Southerners would have been opposed to this. They, remember, didn't have many people and didn't want those people they had to move out west. But this was one of the goals of the Republican Party, and they were able to pass it when all the southern states, which were completely Democratic, left. Okay, so what happens with this is you need to understand that this is a way to try to populate the West. Nobody wanted to move out there, but if you gave people land, 160 acres, which supposedly was enough, it turns out in that dry climate it's not nearly enough. If you moved out west and settled there, you, in quote, improve the land. That means building a house or something on it. You got to keep it. And here you see an example of a homestead deed. Oops, it's already gone, just like the real ones often disappeared because they got bought up by people really quickly. Now, the people who lived there were called homesteaders, but you might also see the term on test as sod busters. Think of the sod meaning ground, like, you know, you sod your house, you put out new grass and stuff. And that's what these people were often called. Why? Well, because there isn't a lot of wood out there. And so they didn't have many woody materials, that says mats, but as materials, they often had to build their houses out of prairie sod, that is grass and dirt. And if you look back here, you can see one of those houses. So these houses were often called soddies, not as in Saudi Arabia, right? Soddies as in people who had houses built out of sod. And you can see that here. Imagine what that was like when it rained. Imagine all the insects and stuff. Man, those were tough, tough people, y'all. Now, in this climate, as I said, a lot of people found that 160 acres was not enough to survive. And often these farms went bankrupt, and sadly, unscrupulous people often would buy them up. But the idea was there. So as I said, many of them end up losing their land. And there was a lot of fake advertising. You guys thought that was something new, right? Well, check out this picture here. It makes this area of Nebraska look like the Garden of Eden or something like that. when in fact this area is quite dry. If any of you have ever been to Iowa, you've been to Nebraska, you know that there's really not a single tree. I mean, not one. Well, maybe a couple. But this is kind of what they made it look like. You know, and this land would be put up for sale. This was actually ones that were for sale, but you got it free from the government if you stayed there for 5 years. So please make sure you know the Homestead Act passed during the Civil War as one of the main reasons people moved out west. Now later we'll talk about the railroads, and the railroads of course play a key role in making it a whole lot easier for people to go out there and settle, and also to arm the military that would be able to make sure they got to keep that land. All right, so companies often defrauded them, as you can see with ads like this, and this land that had been really hard won by these folks gets lost. But please remember the Homestead Act is a key in getting people to go settle out there. Now here you see a little video that will probably get taken out.
The Great
by
Plains,
YouTube.
conquered by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad threads a thin line of civilization through the wilderness. People
Or the
follow.
choo-choos, it's better known.
In just 1 year, 40,000 settlers moved to Nebraska, fanning out
No
across the
CGI was
frontier
used in the making of
in
this
wagon
video.
trains.
When in the mid-19th century to the late 19th century, they went out and settled some hostile territory known to mankind, the Great Plains where I grew up. These were true pioneers.
The government accelerates the process with the greatest land giveaway in history.
There you go. Make sure you know
Anyone
this.
with a $10 filing fee can claim
$10.
free land.
Couple
A
hundred
quarter
bucks today.
are single women and ex-slaves.
When you see the desperate scramble in
Now, the
these
ex-slaves
rickety
who went
wagon
out there were known
trains,
as exodusters.
you
Get it?
realize
They
that
were
the
free
promise of
people who
America
went out west,
was land.
you know,
These are people
Exodus,
who
the
never
Bible.
in a million years would be able
Jesse.
to own land in Europe.
You thought only
Eventually,
today people were clever.
10% of the United States will be given away under the Homestead Act.
Here we go. Good video. Hopefully that video doesn't get cut. If not, I will. If it does, I'll post it for you guys to see because it does a good job of describing that. All right, on to the next one because I know you're excited and waiting. Okay, so we're going to talk particularly about Native Americans. I'm sure on your test there'll be some questions about Native Americans and what happened to them. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about them. All right, so here's your key concepts. You know, I always give those to you because they do provide a lot of information and they show you that what I'm trying to cover is stuff that they are expecting you guys to know. So, large numbers of migrants moved there, as we said, in search of land and, of course, economic opportunity. Like I said, the former slaves, the so-called exodusters, which is also a popular topic, remember, and most of them went to Kansas, these former slaves who were trying to get a start, you know, to start all over. And, of course, since there were already people there, there's going to be violent conflict. And here we see hopes of achieving ideals of self-sufficiency and independence. Migrants moved to both rural and boomtown. A boomtown is like a town that grows up overnight. Something is discovered there. Maybe it's a mine or more recently oil or something. And people go there for a variety of opportunities. Of course, some of them worked on the railroad. Some of them worked in mining, farming, and ranching. When we come back to this at the end of the year, and I'm preparing you guys to take the real AP test, I'll go over these folks in some more detail, but I'm just trying to hit the things that are more likely to be on a district test today, okay? All right, so another key concept, this competition for land between the whites, the Indians, and Mexican Americans is going to lead to, yes, that's right, again, violent conflict. And even more key concepts here, just so you know that. We're going to mention, of course, what happens to the American bison. You and I know them as the buffalo. It says they were decimated. That is the wrong word. They were not decimated. Decimated means 10% of them were killed. It was more like 10% of them maybe were left, or 1%. I always hate when they use the word decimated when it's just, anyway. And so competition for resources in the West among white settlers, American Indians, Mexican Americans. Once again, what did it lead to? That's right, violent conflict. That should be the key words for today. And here we see, as they move there and have, once again, violent conflict, we see the mentioning of the treaty violation with Native Americans. This is always a popular topic by AP, so be ready to respond to what were the treaties about, and how were they usually handled. So when the treaties were violated, there was resistance. Once again, guess what? Violent conflict between Native Americans and the military and with settlers, okay? And eventually the way it ends, spoiler alert, Native Americans are moved to reservations. And as you guys will see, they are expected to assimilate. And for a long time, they don't have tribal sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word you guys have heard me say a lot this year. Please make sure you know what that word means. It means your self-rule, your right to rule yourself, right? Remember we talked about popular sovereignty, rule of the people in determining whether slavery would be in the territories or not. All right. Now, here we go about the buffalo, or the bison as they're more properly called. We talked about the beginning of the year how much Native Americans depended on the buffalo or the bison. It was their Walmart on hooves, right? You know, everything you need on one animal, basically. My picture here is kind of blocking it. But they relied on it for most of their food, their clothing, their shelter, their tools, you name it, it came on the buffalo. But as the railroads were built, of course, they needed food for the railroad workers. And the buffalo were relatively easy. They're, I hate to say it, but one of the stupidest creatures man and God ever created. They'll just kind of stand there while their neighbors are getting shot and stuff, and thousands of them, probably even millions of them, ultimately were shot. One of the things that became kind of cool for people to have were the so-called buffalo robes. Now this is a picture I got, and what's sad about this picture, y'all, is this is only half of the picture. If you saw the full picture, it goes way off to the side. It's about twice this big. Now, each of those hides, of course, represents a buffalo. That became a really cool thing to have buffalo robes, so yet another reason to shoot them. And, of course, the thing is, they wanted the Indians to go to the reservations. If you kill the buffalo, you're destroying their food source, like we said, and everything else. This was a way to hasten the Native Americans going to the reservation. So please make sure you understand that the buffalo were targets, not just for practical reasons, robes, buffalo tongue, buffalo meat to feed people, but also was used as a weapon to force Native Americans to go to the reservations. Trains, of course, people were shot there. Hunters like the famous Buffalo Bill Cody racked up hundreds of kills. I remember a story when the Tsar came over from Russia, or the future Tsar, George Custer. Here you see a picture of him, took the future Tsar out on a hunt, and they themselves racked up hundreds of kills. It's just awful. And then this picture is devastating, y'all. If you wonder what this is, these are buffalo skulls, and this man is standing at the very, very top of it, okay? That just gives you an idea of a few of them that were killed. So please understand this. It's specifically mentioned in your AP curriculum, and so there you go. All right, now the treaties, okay? Now, the treaties that were made between Native Americans, their Indian nations or tribes in the U.S., were done to have borders. Okay, and then to describe the behavior between the parties, what you could do and couldn't do. If you were not of the Indian tribe, you were supposed to have a passport to be able to cross, once again, that word, sovereign Indian lands. Here's an example of a treaty. I'm not sure, this might be Fort Laramie over here. I'm not sure, I made this slide some time ago. But remember, after that court decision, Native Americans were considered more of a domestic tribe without sovereignty. They were dependent on the government. And these new treaties had to be approved by the U.S. Congress. Now, we've talked a lot about early in the year this different concept of property and land ownership. So oftentimes Native Americans believed when they were making a treaty, it wasn't we sign a treaty and we leave. We sign a treaty and you come on and you use your land like we do, right? And so that was a big, big difference. Also, we kind of assumed that Native Americans operated on sort of the same governmental method that we do, where they had one leader that maybe was elected, and that leader could make decisions for the others. But what often happened, y'all, is within a tribe there might be various leaders. And what often happened is you could find one leader who would sign or make his mark on behalf of the tribe, and the other tribes would never recognize this. So understand there's a lot of cultural confusion here in these agreements. Not all Native Americans would have agreed to them, right? Often you could bribe a few chiefs. and then claimed that the whole tribe had agreed to it. So, yeah, there were some people definitely being what we used to call bamboozled as a result of this. Now, here's a famous quote allegedly made by Chief Red Cloud. Now, for some reason, my brother, and we share the same mom and dad, always believed he was more Native American than I was. I don't know how that's possible, but I remember he used to say this: "They made us many promises, more than I can remember. They kept just one. They promised to take our land, and they did." Or they took it. That's how I remember him quoting it. Yep. And so that's a good quote. If you ever have to write about it, I remember that one. So a lot of these tribes, y'all, these treaties that were made were actually broken. There were a lot that probably were kept. I'm not going to say they all were broken, but understand cultural confusion. Also some really greedy people as well often didn't follow these. All right. I could spend a whole probably week, sadly, talking about a lot of the violent conflict and some of the incidents that happen. I'm going to mention just one of the worst right now, and that's what happens during the Civil War, the infamous massacre at Sand Creek, which this happens outside of Denver, Colorado in 1864. Here you see a picture of it. Now, Chief Black Kettle, shown over here, had survived an attack earlier in, I think, in Oklahoma land in what is called the Washita area. He was a Cheyenne. That was the other big tribe in addition to the Sioux. And he had been promised, this gives you an example of a lot of the broken deals, promised protection as long as he flew an American flag, kind of essentially acknowledging American sovereignty over his land. So he had relocated out to Wyoming. But there had been an Indian attack on some white settlers. And as so often happens, a group was raised, right, to go out and to find these Indians and attack the whites and to get revenge or stop them from doing it. It was a voluntary cavalry regiment was raised under a man by the name of John Shivington. I think I got his picture coming up here in just a bit. Yeah, here it is, right behind Mr. D. And he and his men rode out and they attacked this village in Sand Creek, Colorado. Most of the Indian men were out hunting, so what were left were women and children. Here you see the Sand Creek. So when these cavalrymen came running in, there were very few people to protect the Indian village. Black Kettle went out, put up the American flag, or waved it, as you often hear, but it didn't save him that day. It didn't save his wife. Didn't save a lot of the people. And this is one of the worst, because when Shivington and his men came back to Denver, they didn't say anything about the Indian men being gone. They just talked about it being a glorious victory. And when the truth came out, when the newspapers began to report the stories, a lot of people were appalled, right? They just thought this was just murder, and essentially it was. This cannot be defended in any modern way or way. Even back then, people knew that that was wrong. 100 Indians were killed. I don't want to get into the gross stories. You can look them up yourself, but a lot of the Indian women were mutilated for souvenirs. It's awful, y'all. Okay.
At sunrise on November 29th, 1864, Colonel John Shivington's command begins to arrive near the village of Chief Black Kettle and the other leaders, maybe as many as 600 people, 130, 140 teepees or lodges camped in a bend of Sand Creek. By sunrise, the command has split up. Detachments or companies of men have gone to either side of the valley. Cheyenne people have noticed.
Okay, the other key battle they expect you guys to know, and it's really more of a massacre, is what happened at Wounded Knee Creek in 1890. This is the last major battle or conflict of the Native Americans. So if you need kind of a bookend when you're talking, this is one you could mention, right, in your AP test if you're talking about the Native American wars or the Plains Wars. Now, many of the Sioux Indian particularly had begun to follow this new religion called the Ghost Dance. It had actually started more out in the Rocky Mountain area, but it had made its way around and A lot of Native American people were looking for something, for some sort of hope. And this dance told them, as part of it, if they danced, they followed everything, the white man would go away, the buffalo would return, they would get things back. But with the Sioux, it also had an additional feature, apparently. It's kind of dangerous, and that is if you dance the dance, if you wear the sacred garments, you would be bulletproof. The guns could not hurt you, and that, of course, is very, very dangerous. And so what happened is a group of Native Americans had followed this, the Sioux Indians, as well as a lot of others, but the Sioux leave their reservation. They literally go off the reservation, which is a term that people used to use to say they're not following orders, they're not following instructions. Probably don't use it today, I suspect, like a lot of things, to be considered politically incorrect, but it used to be that you would say, oh, they've left the reservation. So they did. They left the reservation, and they're going to pay greatly for it. Here you see a picture of the village of the Sioux near what is called Wounded Knee Creek. Now, they were ordered to surrender and give up their weapons, and they were surrounded by members of the 7th Cavalry. Now, we didn't really talk about Custer. We'll go into detail later on in the year when we come back to this and talk about the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand, as people call it. But it was his unit. Now, this is 14 years later, so not the same people probably, but these Indians were ordered to give up their weapons. Many of them did drop their weapons and surrender. Some managed to hang on to them. Apparently, one who was deaf didn't hear the orders, at least that's the story you sometimes hear, and shots were fired, and of course, many people were massacred. This is some of the awful images that come from it. Here we see one of the Native Americans. It was cold, right? This was in the winter time, and he was kind of propped up here for a picture. Yeah, that's what people used to do, sadly. But and the men were buried. The Native American men, women, and children who died in this were buried altogether, about 300. Here you see yet another one of them. And if you see these images, I don't know if they'd put them on an AP test or not. They're quite graphic, so they probably wouldn't. But if you do see them, you know where this came from. Pictures were taken of them, and then they were buried in a mass grave where there is a monument today. And here you see them being buried. You see the 7th Cavalry back here in their winter clothes as they're being buried in a mass grave. This is the last major conflict of the Indian Wars, or the Plains Wars, whatever you want to call it. So it's a bookend that you guys should be aware of and know. Now, this will probably be blocked, of course, but this is from a movie called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It was on HBO. It kind of shows you the attack as the women and children are being gathered together, and this Native American in the hospital is being questioned. Looks like the writing here is in Czech or something. So.
Doctor. It was at Wounded Knee, near where we were dancing.
Here you see the Hotchkiss cannons.
They tried to take our weapons.
Did you see them turning over the weapons?
You had more than this. You had Winchesters and Henrys. I know you had Winchesters and Henrys.
Winchesters and Henrys are a type of rifle. It's a repeating rifle, one that you could load 6, 7, 8, 10 or more bullets in and continue firing.
Messiah's promise will come true. The bullets will not harm you. Their bullets will not harm you.
Their bullets will not harm you. Hear him saying that?
They tried to take a gun from a deaf man. They couldn't hear and they didn't care.
You see the one guy who can't hear. Gun goes off. That's all it takes. Like I said, this will probably be blocked, but there you go. Alrighty. Now in 1973, I know it's partially cut off of here. We'll get into more detail. It's kind of out of the unit, and I'll come back to it. But in 1973, in a disagreement among the tribal leaders, some Sioux Indians seized the town. They seized the headquarters of the Sioux tribal government, and basically kept American soldiers, FBI agents, and others away for some time. And it was known as the Siege at Wounded Knee. It was 1973. Mr. D was like in what, 5th grade, I guess. But I remember that one pretty well. Right. Now, many Native Americans worked to preserve their cultures and tribal identities despite the government policies that promoted assimilation. You see that term's in red, and that means I'll talk more about that in some detail for you guys, okay? We'll talk about the act that does it, what it means, and come back to that. Now, here is the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. This actually prefigures the Wounded Knee battle there. But assimilation policy. Now, to assimilate means to, makes me always think of Star Trek Next Generation. I know you guys don't watch that or probably haven't, but where you're supposed to assimilate with the Borg, become part of the Borg, look like the Borg, do all of that. And assimilation, until relatively recently, was our policy for immigration in this country. People that come here would be asked to learn the language, adopt a lot of the customs and values, and that was called assimilation. Okay, it's part of the idea also in your STAR test known as the melting pot, where you would come in, we take your cultures, your ideas, and you're mixed with sort of what we already have. And just like if you guys have ever had a stew or anything like that, it all kind of ends up tasting the same and kind of even looking the same in a lot of ways, but you add something that might change it just slightly or whatever. And so that was the idea of assimilation, or the melting pot. So we expected Native Americans, once they were defeated on reservations, to start acting this way and following the white man rule, as they called it at the time. So what they do is, the land that had been given to Indians is reservations, right? Or I say given to land, it was land that had been theirs that they were given parts of back, or allowed to keep parts of, were divided up into individual plots of land. And you would get a certain amount of land for every individual. And then, of course, so as a family, you might own a couple hundred acres. And then what you were supposed to do is to become a farmer. You were supposed to start working on the land. And, you and I might say, okay, well, I would do that. But once again, realize that a lot of these Sioux Indians had been warriors, and if we remember, we talked at the beginning of the year how there was a very clear division of labor by gender. Men hunted, fished, fought in war. Women did the gardening, educated the kids in that, and now to suddenly expect the men to start doing that, almost immediately, was something very, very difficult for them to do. So the policy is not going to work very, very well. A lot of Native American men are going to have their land kind of stolen, just like I mentioned. A lot of the settlers are going to have their land stolen during the Homestead Act. There's always greedy people out there that will manipulate systems and do that, and sadly, that's what happened. So a lot of the Native American lands actually shrunk quite a bit because of this policy of giving it to families rather than having the tribe, or the the nation, as they like to call it now, have it. Now, so as we said, assimilation means giving up your language. They should say Indian language, religion, sort of their way of life, and become, quote, American. And there was a phrase at the time, and this is one that would be worthwhile you learning. Advocates for Native Americans urged them to do this. I know that sounds kind of weird. Today, this wouldn't work, of course, or nobody could say this. But the idea was, if they don't change, if they don't assimilate, they're going to be killed. So the phrase that was used was, kill the Indian to spare the man. In other words, kill what is Indian inside of them so that they can be allowed to live. And, at the time, that might have been the best thing. If they didn't do it, they probably would have been killed. So assimilation was the only choice for a lot of them. Now I'm going to show you a picture here of some Apache Indians out of New Mexico or Arizona that had been captured. And here you see them just after the surrender of their leader. And you see their sort of clothes here. Apaches did not dress like others. They wore a combination of kind of Mexican clothes and white clothes and things that they could. But you see their long hair, you see sort of the way they look. Now here's a picture of the same group of Indians after they were sent off to the boarding school, and this is 4 months later. Notice the change of attire, notice the hair, notice just sort of their disposition, right? How they're looking. This is the Dawes Act. This is assimilation at work. So please make sure you are aware of that. After you see a picture of like this, you could talk about it in an essay if it comes up. You could reference this, and a good AP reader would know exactly what you're going to talk about. Now, this was at Carlisle. The title was down here just a while ago. Carlisle was up in Pennsylvania, and a lot of Native Americans had been sent there to be educated, or some people would say re-educated. And so Carlisle was one of those places. The great athlete Jim Thorpe, which I talk about in the 1920s, had gone to Carlisle, but that's a whole nother story.